Good evening, and thank you for joining us on the Illinois Newsroom Facebook page and Illinois Public Media's YouTube channel. I'm Lee Gaines, education reporter at Illinois Newsroom and WILL. This is the second conversation in a two-part town hall series about university policing. In the first installment earlier this month, we discussed the role of campus police at the University of Illinois, as well as data detailing who they arrest and why there's a growing movement on this campus and others across the country to defund and abolish the university police. You can find a recording of that discussion on our Facebook and YouTube pages. This evening, we're going to build off that conversation by focusing on alternatives to campus policing, including both restorative and transformative justice practices, what that means, and how it could be implemented at this university and others. For those of you watching this panel on Facebook and YouTube, I encourage you to submit questions that we can then pass along to our panelists. Illinois Public Media staffers are monitoring our pages and sending me the questions you ask. And we'll get to those questions in the second half of our program. The number to text your questions to is 217-803-0730. So let me introduce our panelists this evening. We have Craig Futterman. He's a clinical professor of law and a resident dean at the University of Chicago Law School. He also founded and has served as the director of the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project at the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic since 2000. And we have Austin Hoffman, a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Illinois and a member of the campus's Graduate Employees Organization, which advocates for the defunding of university police. And Naomi Palk, who is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois. Her research and teaching focuses on racism and imprisonment, policing, and immigration issues. We also have with us Tyler Keyworth, who is the Assistant Director for Conflict Resolution and Restorative Justice at the University of Colorado Boulder. In this role, he oversees the university's conflict resolution and restorative justice efforts. And last but certainly not least, we have Dylan Rodriguez, who is a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California, Riverside, and also the president of the American Studies Association. And Rodriguez is a member of UCFTP, Cops Off Campus, which is a faculty-led movement with the goal of removing cops from the campuses of California colleges and universities by this coming fall. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this discussion tonight. So again, I want to let everyone know, for those of you watching at home, that we did invite the University of Illinois Police Department Chief Alice Carey and U of I Police Training Institute Director Michael Schlosser and a representative of the U of I administration to participate in this discussion. They agreed to participate in our first discussion earlier this month, but declined to participate in this one. So just a disclosure for everyone at home. So let's get into our discussion. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the elephant in the room, which I think is the fear that some people have when they hear phrases like defund the police or a world without police. So I'm going to ask each of you to give me your elevator pitch, essentially, for why we should consider and establish alternatives to policing and incarceration. Austin, let's begin with you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Lee, and everybody at the newsroom for organizing this and inviting me on. And I want to say too that I approach this as someone who's learning every day and doesn't have all the answers. And these are questions that I struggle with every day, like a lot of people, about safety and addressing harm. But my vision for a campus and a world is one that's based on healing, accountability, solidarity, and repairing harm rather than punishment and the caging and torture of people that have been labeled as broken somehow. And this would mean prioritizing the needs and experiences of survivors of violence and providing them with the material and emotional support needed to address their situations on their own terms and not on the terms of an inherently racist and classist and patriarchal criminal justice system. This would mean also allowing those who perpetuate harm to proactively address their situations and change their behavior so as not to continue those cycles. And on a broader level, this means, as many people will talk about tonight, addressing the societal conditions that lead people to desperate situations and to commit even violent acts. So on our campus specifically, this would mean living wages for all workers, whether they're graduate workers like myself or adjunct faculty, building and food service workers, even the resident hall advisors who are undergraduates who are employed here. That would mean making sure no one's hungry or food insecure or has access to housing, and families have access to childcare. Of course, meaning comprehensive healthcare and disability services, robust mental health with counselors who provide trauma-informed care, and people who can address the needs specifically of Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans and queer folk. And so people staffing it with people from those communities, right? Creating alternatives to 911 so people can have access to emergency services where trained violence responders can address situations without the threat of incarceration or deadly force. And again, more broadly, just really democratizing and transforming the university as it is, and expanding and redistributing its resources to the community in which it is embedded. So for me, that's a world without police, what I just described.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. And what about you, Craig?
Sorry, I'm still on the unmute. Thank you. I guess first, I'll start with just about 3 weeks ago or so. I live in an undergraduate dorm, and I went down to the front desk, and then I saw 2 university police officers who just arrived, and I learned quickly the reason why they were there was that a student who lived in my building was at risk of committing suicide, and the officers, seemed nice. I mean, they weren't coming to try to be like jerks or anything like that. And but it just like, I mean, just starting with the question of, is bringing 2 armed officers or calling 2 armed officers as being, that's the first call when someone here on campus is at risk and in crisis, is that the right thing to be doing? And that without even knocking who they are, the backgrounds of training and all the rest of that stuff, the best trained armed officers. And it's so much like square peg round hole. And just the default that I've seen of looking to the police as the answer to all our social problems. And also thinking about police in terms of what they are as an institution. If you're a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And the primary tools and powers that are unique to policing, I mean, what's unique to policing, at least as policing exists right now, are the powers of arrest and the powers to use force. But, our arrest and force, solutions to mental illness, solutions to helping people in crisis, drug addiction, much less the resolution of interpersonal conflict. One, I'll say it's not even fair to the police to say solve stuff that they're far from suited to do. And now it's another reality. You can't talk about policing, or I can't talk about policing without talking about racism, without talking about brutality, without talking about impunity. Themes that have remained at the forefront throughout the history of policing in America to the present day. And as much progress as we've made on so many fronts, here we are still in 2021, and tens of millions of people in America remain incapable of seeing Black folks as fully human. Tens of millions of people still believe here in America that Black lives don't matter, at least not as much as the white lives. And many of those folks are police officers. But the problem in policing is far more than a problem of a collection of racist individuals. It's about a racist institution. From the very inception to the present day, policing has served as a means of social control. From slave patrols in the South to today's mass incarceration, where we have more Black folks locked up today in the United States than were incarcerated before the Civil War. more Black folks incarcerated in America right now than were locked up in Southern Africa at the heart of apartheid. And all in the name of public safety, with the irony, of course, that we're not made more safe. Locking up 1 million Black folks in the name of public safety has not made Americans more safe. And I guess, sure, one other thing, and I'll wrap up. I mean, I'm personally also long known the visceral reality of systemic police abuse, and not of others, but of people who I love, family, dear friends who've been locked up and locked out of opportunity of this so-called American dream. And while, just to share just one other story for wrapping up, while this did involve on-duty police officers, I'll tell you something that hit me really particularly hard over the last year or so was the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Just jogging, right? I can't even begin to put to words the anger that has consumed me, and at the same time also couldn't contain pain. And I feel like I've long since run out of tears. And I've also found myself profoundly afraid, especially as I think of like my 2 young nephews just outside of Atlanta, again, just jogging. And it's not like I'm not, or I wasn't viscerally aware of the ongoing reality of racism when I watched the video of those white men hunt down and murder another young Black man, this time for jogging in a white neighborhood. But even having that knowledge doesn't make the pain of racism hurt any less. And honest with all of y'all, I couldn't function for days. So when you ask this question too, you know, about abolition, but, you know, should we, in essence, what a lot of folk ask me is, should we be trying to think about reforming or rethinking public safety models, both on campus in the United States? Like Austin, I mean, I'm not going to say I don't struggle with this too, but more and more I find myself in the rethink camp, knowing that we need to do something different than we've always done. We need to be willing to experiment, to try new things, to be creative, and fundamentally to reimagine what public safety should look like.
Thank you for that, Craig. I really appreciate it. In the interest of time, because there's so much to get to in this discussion, Naomi, could you give us your elevator pitch, but also kind of make it as brief as possible?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Lee, again, so much for the reporting that you've done on this really important issue and for hosting these town halls. I spoke about this at the last town hall about how we need to correct the false claims that policing will create safety. And so I think there's this real misconception that police make us safer. And the exact opposite is actually true. But we have been so socialized and trained to believe that policing will create safety that we have to kind of like address the cop in our head, right? So that's one thing. But I want to think about, first of all, even if we judge cops on their own terms, like solving and preventing crime, they're really, really terrible at it, right? So I gave a bunch of statistics last time around violent crimes like murders and rapes and the kind of rates of clearance rates for cops. And they're really, really terrible. They're really bad at what they do on their own terms, not even talking about abolitionist terms. And then the other thing that I would want to address in terms of the question of fear, people are afraid that if we get rid of cops and jails and prisons, that, you know, I'm just left on my own to protect myself and safeguard my own safety. And that's absolutely not what we're talking about. We're talking about not just keeping society as it is and then getting rid of those harmful institutions of police, prisons, and surveillance. We're talking about creating a society where we don't have police, prisons, or surveillance because we don't actually need them. Because we have created a society in which people have their needs met and can thrive with what they have, which means that they're not put in situations where they have to steal food or live outside, right, without a house or something like that, right? So we want to instead of investing into failed solutions that don't produce what we want, which is communal safety, which is police, right? They don't do what we want. Let's invest in something else. And so we need to invest in all the resources that all of us need to thrive. So like food, shelter, education, mental health care, physical health care, and so on, right? And I know that this isn't going to happen tomorrow. So I'll just give like a really quick example following what Craig was saying. right? So let's think about a specific example around mental health care, right? So one step that we can take right now is to move mental health crisis calls completely out of police, right? And have something more based on the CAHOOTS model, where you have other trained counselors and mental health experts respond to those kinds of crisis calls. They're unarmed, et cetera, right? This is a first but insufficient step, right? Because it still relies on this model where we're calling on somebody else to come fix our problems only when it comes to a crisis. So what we also need, in addition to a non-police first responder team, is that we need a robust investment in mental health care itself, right? So we need more mental health counseling for our students, right? And also we want to invest in those, we want to support students' holistic safety and well-being. It means that we make sure that students have affordable, accessible housing and food, which they do not, right? That's why we have multiple food pantries on our campus, right? That's why we have students who aren't making rent and aren't paying their bills every single month, right? So we also need to make sure that their material needs are met. And so we're addressing like the holistic kind of approach to their mental health and well-being, so that they don't get to a crisis to where we have to call someone to help us, right? And we would also invest in helping our students learn how to skill up, right? And learn how to work through things like conflict in their relationships, or with their professors, or the people that they work with communication skills, with confronting mistakes that they've made, and working through different kinds of negative feelings, right? When we come into interpersonal conflicts, so that we're enabling them to deal with the kind of constant stresses that they're under, right? Both materially and in terms of like their social relationships. So while we're removing police from this kind of situation entirely, from these situations where they really have no business being there at all, we would more importantly strive to address the root causes of mental health distress, right? And then through that, we would try to create a situation where we reduce the overall number of crisis calls in the first place. So that's just one example of how abolition might look like right now, and concrete steps that we can take right now if it weren't for the obstruction of certain entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. I really appreciate that. And Tyler, same to you. A brief, as brief as you can be, kind of your pitch for alternatives to policing, particularly on college campuses.
Great. Thanks so much, Lee, for having us, and really appreciating the conversation so far, and looking forward to seeing where it goes. So my role, I work at University of Colorado Boulder, and I work with the restorative justice program there and the conflict resolution program. And so we do a lot of work with students to help them think that have caused harm, and those who have received harm, to help folks talk through what happened, what harm or impact was caused, and what can be done to make things right. And that process focuses on holding folks accountable in a way that supports them and also helps them learn and grow from what happened, and has some contextual components to it as well, where we're not just having people fit into a specific mold of what punishment should look like, but instead seeing what fits the situation. What do people need, and how can we address those things? So I'll kind of tell a quick story to kind of illuminate some of this stuff. When I was a kid, I don't know if anyone else ever got in trouble with their parents. I did on occasion. And I remember my parents would be like, all right, Tyler, here's the deal. You can go sit on the timeout chair for 10 minutes, or we can sit down at the table and talk about this. And often what would happen is I would choose the timeout chair because it was easy. Because you sit there, you just, all of a sudden the timer dings, 10 minutes up, and you never have to talk about what happened, never have to engage with it, and never have to really wrestle with difficult questions like, why did you hit your brother? How does he feel about this? What do you need to do to make things right? How can you move forward from this? And I think we don't have structures in our society that always give us the ability to have those types of conversations, because they're difficult to have. And that's why I would always choose the timeout chair, because that wasn't the one, that was the one that was the easy way out. So I think I'd like to see a world where we give people the chance to take accountability in a way that promotes conversations around harm and impact that can help to fix problems rather than make them worse through harsh punishments that don't fix the problem. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I appreciate that analogy as well. And Dylan, last but certainly not least, again, a brief elevator pitch, particularly directed at those who aren't familiar with abolition.
Absolutely. Hey, I just want to respond to Tyler's point here. As the parent of two teenagers, I can affirm that 100% of the time they would rather sit in the timeout chair than talk to me or their mom. 100% of the time. This restorative transformative justice thing is hard. It is hard to get people to allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to do it, and it's hard to be the people in charge of it as well. So I'm with you on that. This is taking a culture. It's a cultural revolution as well as a material and institutional one. I'll say a couple quick things that will not be redundant with what my colleagues here have said, and I affirm everything that folks have said so far. I appreciate being here. I love being in this party with you. When we think about police presence and we start to consider whether or not we're going to support and sustain and reform a police presence, this is a moment in which we are speaking to a historical moment. We're part of a historical record in ways we often are not, right? We can't slip by here and have our positions go unnoticed. This is a moment where history is actually looking at us. And here's what I would say. What these last, almost 12 months or so have taught us is that police presence, whether it's on a campus, in a neighborhood, or in a city, police presence is terror. It is asymmetrical terror. It is anti-Black terror. It is white supremacist terror. It is racist terror. At times, it is colonialist terror. It is misogynist and sexist terror. It is Islamophobic terror. It is transphobic terror. It is terror. It's not terror for everybody. That's the point. Right? When people say public safety, what they are actually saying is we are going to normalize a condition of state terror against those people who we deem to be threats to your public safety, whatever that means. And we are going to reproduce that condition as one that is valorized, as protected, as peacekeeping, and all the rest of that. So in this historical moment, if we are going to take the conditions of asymmetrical terror seriously, then we have to understand that you can't respond or you shouldn't respond to terror by reforming it. You can't respond to terror by giving it anti-bias training. You can't respond to terror by making its officers more diverse, right? In fact, all evidence points to the contrary, that the terror machine is actually more effective when you do those things. On the other hand, what we can do, what we have to do is think creatively and collectively about how to abolish the terror. That's what security and safety are, right? You abolish the terror, you address and you repair the terror. So you don't just stop it, you have to repair it. The second thing I'll say that I hope is not too redundant with what folks have already said. What the period of mass movement, revolts, and organizing have also taught us is that what folks are responding to is not the anti-Blackness of individual police officers or even of individual police departments. What movements are responding to and what they are making here is a statement of collective refusal to concede to the normalization of anti-Black policing as asymmetrical domestic warfare. It's a refusal to concede to the normality of anti-Black domestic warfare. That's what this is. And so I think we have to be really careful and vigilant and critical when we start getting sucked into the dialogue of whether to reform and defund or not reform and defund, to say that might be the wrong question. Right? That if we're actually going to take seriously our own analysis of domestic warfare and of terror, that the abolitionist question becomes, I think, a collected and a creative one, and one that brings a bunch of other questions to mind.
Thank you, Dylan. And thanks to everyone for kind of setting the stage for what we're going to get deeper into tonight. But first, we're going to play a 4-minute video, again, to set the stage. And this is going to be perspectives of students. So a team of University of Illinois student journalists interviewed their peers on campus about how they feel about university police, whether they feel safe on campus, and their thoughts on the movement to defund campus cops. So here are some of their responses.
The presence of campus police, I'm not gonna lie, it makes me a little uneasy sometimes, considering like everything that's happened this year and just like, history with police in general. So yeah, but I don't necessarily feel like they're always a threat to me, but I do feel a little on edge when they're around.
I feel like the police presence, we specifically feel the threat more than our white counterparts who make up around like 60 to 70% of the student body's population. So I think that if we were to cut ties or even just have their presence drastically reduced on campus, I feel like it would increase the feelings of safety among Black and brown students. And I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that it would really help.
There definitely needs to be major reform in the police system. However, I don't know if totally defunding the police is the right move. I'm not against it, nor am I really for it.
I mean, I've never really had a really bad interaction with police in general, but it's still, concerning, especially because of my race. But I think for the most part, if I'm just minding my own business and just continuing my day, it goes by fine.
As a Black person in general, I feel there's still that little nerve when there's police around. But overall, on campus, I feel safe, but I have heard that there's more police on the Urbana side compared to like the Champaign side. So that was kind of annoying to hear, just because like the Urbana side is more predominantly of people of minorities.
It's hit or miss sometimes. Sometimes I feel safer with them around, but most of the time I do feel a little bit uneasy, just because sometimes I feel like they're not out patrolling just in case something's going wrong, but they're more like looking for things to go wrong.
My only issue with defund the police is, and this is from my personal experience when I talk to my parents about it, they just don't like the term defund the police. It scares them. They don't want no police, but that's not the goal of the movement. The movement is to reallocate funding and to restructure how the police force works. So we're putting more money into preventative efforts, into social workers and stuff like that. And it's something that when you really sit down and discuss it, you understand, but it's something I fear that there's a disconnect between the label of the movement and what people are screaming in their taglines to what actually the movement is about.
Knowing the budget, like the university's budget, there is way too much put into our safety services, and like for the amount of money that's dumped into it compared to like other social services, I feel like we're not getting like the protection that we are paying for, really. So I fully support defunding the police, the university police, and police across the country, because I think that money could go in places that's a lot more impactful than where it's being spent now.
I know the police do not make communities safer. They endanger the lives of BIPOC people. They endanger the lives of LGBTQ plus, particularly Black trans women. And generally, I genuinely believe that police officers make communities less safe because of the lack of training and the way that the system is set up.
I'm like kind of in the middle, like at the same, like I feel like I agree with those movements, but at the same time I feel like we still need like some police and like oversight, and I just feel like it should be corrected.
It would be nice if campus police were more transparent and open with the community. I know I've never spoken with a campus police officer, and I don't really know what their policies are and how they deal with students and stuff like that. So it would be nice to have more communication between campus police and the university community. But I do support defunding the police and moving towards more community-focused solutions, like using social workers and mental health workers who might be better prepared to answer calls.
And again, thanks to a team of student journalists for helping us collect those voices and those perspectives. And before we move on, I just want to remind our panelists that our time is relatively brief, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to questions. So if we could, make our answers as concise as possible, that would be great. I'm going to ask for some reaction to what we just heard. So Craig, I'm curious what your reaction is, and whether you can connect the sentiments that you're hearing from these students to the work that you do.
Yeah, I guess it never stops, to pain me. One of the things that some of the work that we've done over the last 7 or 8 years has been to talk and just have long-form conversations, embedded conversations with high school students, Black high school students, in and around our campus. And when we have these conversations, it's like, just as so many of the U of I students, or some of the U of I students share, just fear, the threat, just among the things that kids have told me about, all these just adaptive strategies to engage in, so not to be noticed by police. Everything from don't walk alone, but don't be seen in groups. Try to blend in, but don't wear something that really makes you stand out. And it's just like this, and it goes on and on and on and on. And it's like, the bottom line is like, don't go outside. To just be, to strive to be seen as invisible, because being seen as a threat. And always also just like, just how do police look at me? How do I see police? How do police look at me? And seeing me just by just existing as a potential threat, as opposed to a child of God. And I guess those are some of the things that I heard just and resonated immediately with me when I was listening to some U of I student voices as well.
Appreciate that, Craig. Thank you for that reflection. And then Dylan, I'm curious what your take is, and whether some of these comments reflect what you've heard from UC Riverside students.
It is a really fascinating sample size of responses. I think what we need to do is become really good readers, really good interpreters of how policing has become a certain kind of common sense that still has fractures in it. If you go back and watch that video again, what you hear is a number of students, Black students, at least visibly Black students in particular, who are dancing this tension between asserting their own individual experiences, right, as saying, I haven't actually confronted police violence, and then there's a yet, kind of parenthetically, silently lurking in the backdrop of what they say. A couple of those visibly Black students also actually reference that explicitly, saying that even though I haven't, I understand what this police power actually means, right? So there's an uneven, asymmetrical, non-universal sense that police power is always present. It is always a threat for some people whose bodies, whose ways of being are profiled by virtue of police training and so forth, and a kind of discomfort with conceding that power. I think that's what we have to see here. But it lets us know how this is how police power works, right? Is that it gets us into a frame of mind where we cannot imagine places without a police presence. People weren't even talking about safety in those interviews, right? In those sound bites, what people were saying is that it simply is hard to imagine any place like a campus without the police there, right? And so that's what it is that I think police abolitionists confront most immediately, but also that's the opportunity to think really creatively and to win people like that over to much more creative visions of what security and safety would look like, right? If we're talking about the elimination of food and housing insecurity, you start there and you've decriminalized a significant part of the population of the campus and that entire area. If you make universities accountable and open to the communities that they tend to displace and criminalize and gentrify, if you change that relationship, you are decriminalizing that relationship, and you are also kind of beginning to obsolete the need for a patrolling police presence. So there's all kinds of responses to that policing common sense that we could engage, and I hope that this conversation opens into that as we go.
Yeah, definitely. And then Tyler, I'm curious if you've heard similar concerns from students at the University of Colorado Boulder, and how some of this mistrust or distrust among students and law enforcement, does that affect the work that you do in the restorative justice program there?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is, I think that this is a different conversation than we were all having a year ago. And I think that's a really good thing. There's been a lot of reform has happened in a lot of different areas, and police departments are now kind of like that's coming up. And I think that's really a really good conversation to have. And there's a lot of awesome ideas that folks have about how to do that, and heard a couple things already today about that. And in terms of the University of Colorado Boulder, these are definitely conversations that are happening on campus as well there to address. And we have kind of two police departments that work in we have the University of Colorado Police Department, and we also have the Boulder Police Department. And so they both have different jurisdictions, and they're two different entities that don't share, they're totally separate. So you have kind of two different conversations about what happens with each, and depending on whether students live on or off campus. So it has some different nuance. It has some nuance there, but these are definitely conversations that are happening. And in terms of our processes, it definitely is something that comes up in terms of how do we respond when somebody maybe gets a ticket for an obstruction of justice charge, when they're saying like, hey, I only got this ticket because of my identity, right? And the question is, how do you respond to that, right? What is the right way to go about dealing with situations like that? So those are the things that we end up wrestling with in the restorative justice program at CU and DCFIT.
Thank you, Tyler. And then Naomi, how does this reflect or complement or work with what you've heard from students on this campus?
Yeah, I think it resonates with what I've heard from other students on this campus. And I kind of want to just reiterate what Dylan was saying, that like, there is like the cops are in our heads, right? And this is not my tagline. This is from Paula Jimena Rojas. But like, we have been socialized into believing that that a world without police is actually not possible, even as we know that police terrorize communities. And I do think that we need to note that that there is a different kind of tenor to the response based on who is responding and what kind of body they're inhabiting. Right. And I think that's part of it. And this is part of what Dylan was talking about in terms of its asymmetrical terror. Like, some of us are just not going to be subject to this kind of terror in the ways that other people are, including myself. I am not subject to, I mean, a cop is likely to look at me and think that, you know, I'm good at math and not about to commit, whatever, any of the criminalized acts that aren't actually harmful, right? So, but I think we need to be mindful of that. And I also want to point out that, like, I understand that there's a kind of uneasiness around the term defund or like the project of abolition. And it was interesting to me that one of them referred to their parents. My parents are scared, right? Because they don't see me every day. They're sending me away to get my education here. And they want to know that the police are there to make sure that those other boogeyman people are not going to affect my day-to-day, right? And so again, there's this kind of asymmetry there. But at the same time, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have terror at all, right? And that instead we fostered a kind of campus culture and a campus community where we actually get at the root causes of harm, right? That we make sure that all, not just people on campus, but the people who in the communities that we live with have the things that they need. And so we reduce the risk of harm for everyone, not just by police, but in terms of our interpersonal relationships, right? And I think that we need to do a little bit more work to get people to get the cop out of their head and to think more broadly about what does safety actually mean, right? It's not just about crime and cops, right? It's about having resources with the resources that you need to thrive and live well and contribute, right? And so it's about understanding how to socialize with each other, right? Learning how to deal with conflict with each other and so on. So I'll stop there just for time.
Thank you, Naomi. I appreciate that. And we'll get more into what safety means and what that could look like in the absence of cops further on in our discussion. But finally, Austin, there were a number of nuanced views in what we just heard. So I'm curious how you and other activists on this campus address some of that ambivalence that I heard coming up in some of the responses.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Lee. Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that, as I think several of the folks have already sort of gestured to, is like, we've been socialized in such a way and we've been educated very often in such a way where, again, like policing and public safety are like synonymous in people's heads, and we need to decouple those things for reasons already mentioned. And so we are really trying to do the work, like, as much as we talk about removing cops and removing the punitive mechanisms, we're really starting to move towards maybe talking more so about like what would different forms of safety look like. And there are a lot of models out there, whether that's like Asada's Daughters in Chicago, or Aim for Peace, which is in my hometown of Kansas City, or the Audre Lorde Project in New York City, like that have been practicing forms of safety outside of the systems of policing and prisons for a long time because they've had to, because police never protected them in the first place, right? So once you provide an alternative that seems like really tangible and pragmatic to people, I think that ambivalence can really dissipate. And then the second brief point is that when people talk about being concerned about what would happen if police aren't around, they're often talking, like, want to think about these spectacular forms of violence, like something terrible like sexual assault or murder or getting mugged or something like that. And we are saying we need to preempt those things so the conditions for that lead to those things don't even happen in the first place. And it's not going to be perfect, obviously, but we could definitely address the root causes of it. And so we need to be focusing on that just as much as these sort of boogeyman, spectacular forms of violence that sort of lead to a fear-mongering view, which the police use to legitimate themselves without actually doing anything to address those root causes, right? So that's my reaction to the video.
Yeah, and I want to stick with you for a moment, Austin. I also want to acknowledge something about, the group of people that we've assembled here. Everyone is a scholar or an academic or works for an academic institution. And so what I really want to do is kind of connect some of these ideas that we're talking to tangible things. And so Austin, starting with you, this was brought up actually by one of the students, is the budget that's spent on police here. It's about $8.2 million annually. It has risen somewhat over the years. So what would you actually like to spend that money? What do the activists who are calling on the defunding want to spend that money on in very concrete terms?
Sure, Lee, thank you so much. I guess just a couple of examples. One would be moving a lot of what police would call as like the non-core functions of policing. I think that's the term. Naomi, you can correct me. But stuff like the student patrol, which primarily just walks around campus town and on campus, before COVID, right, to make sure people are not overly intoxicated, they can get home safely, right? Trying to maybe intervene in conflict. Move that out of the purview of the police. That's where it's under right now, right? There's no reason it has to be there if that is their mandate. And right now what the model does is empower students to act like cops and to pretty much, just report with their walkie-talkie to police so they can come to the scene and often make the situation worse than it needs to be and blow it out of proportion, right? So that's one very concrete thing that would just require some organizational shifting, some shifting of funds. Those people need to be paid better as well, by the way. And the other bigger vision would be establishing something that is like a restorative justice or a transformative justice center, like where Tyler works at, or the transformative justice center that's at Brown University, that totally is trying to remove policing from instances of harm or conflict and abuse. And I say those things distinctly because they're different things, right? There's different levels of severity there. So those are just a couple of examples. And I could talk about, stuff that's happening in the community that I think we should be partnering with too, in addition to like all of the robust mental health stuff that Naomi and I already talked about earlier.
Yeah, Naomi, is there anything that you want to add there? Because I know that you are working with activists in this movement.
Yeah, I'm gonna plus one, a hardcore plus one to the Transformative Justice Center. And the way, like, if I could just, if someone just gave me a bag of money and just let me do it, like, I would want this TJ Center to not just be for our students and our campus community, but also for the larger Champaign County community, as well as not just practicing and praxis, but also thinking about research that could be done through the center to promote and to have a more robust kind of research base to kind of further and advance the goals of transformative justice. So it would be a multi-dimensional kind of transformative justice center that is not just for us, but is for all of us. And it would be an ideal site to kind of experiment with different kinds of techniques. Transformative justice processes, when there's been interpersonal harm, will not be the same in each case. It will have to be different because the conflict is different, the people are different, right? But this is a great place to kind of experiment with new models, all those new models that Austin was referring to. We need to give people concrete examples of what this could look like. And a TJ Center could help us kind of play with different kinds of models and examples, and then think about best practices for different kinds of situations. We could become a national leader if the university would just decide that this is worth investing in, instead of investing $8.2 million into cops. right? This is not an illegitimate claim. This is something that we can do. Tyler's very existence and presence on this panel proves that, right? But this is not just like a funding issue. This is a political issue. And I think that there's a great investment in protecting the university reputation and protecting university property that is overriding an emphasis on our community, including our students, our workers, and the surrounding community. And I think we really need to have an ethical kind of shift in that direction. And the budget is a document of our priorities. And it is a document of our ethical priorities, right? So in this, I'll just say one more thing. While the UIPD budget keeps on going up and up and up, the budgets for things like ethnic studies, the budgets for things like the Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Relations, things like this, the people who actually serve students of color, right, who actually think about things of institutional racism and things like that, our budgets are the ones that are always being defunded, right? So again, this is a question of our priorities as a university and what we feel is worth investing in. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. And we are going to get to Tyler and we're going to get to restorative justice. But Dylan, I want to go to you for a moment. If you could talk a little bit about the movement that you are a part of, and if you could connect, do the activists on your campuses in California, are they also interested in transformative justice? And if so, could you give me a very concrete definition of what that means?
I can. And yeah, the answer is yes. There's an interest, but also some skepticism about transformative justice, but it might not be for the reasons you think. I'll say that there's a lot of interest in the most autonomous versions of transformative justice. So if I was going to define transformative justice, it would have to be it would have to be tied to forms of implementation and processes that are independent and autonomous of the university administration, of the state, right? That this has to be about people that have positions of credibility and leadership in their communities, actually leading these processes. That's the only way you're going to get authentic justice, buy-in, and accountability. It's not going to happen if transformative justice or restorative justice end up being extensions of the district attorney's office, extensions of student discipline, extensions of the regents, university presidents and chancellors. That's the skepticism that I'm talking about. Is I think we have to be vigilant in pushing back against all the attempts by different kinds of administrations to appropriate and absorb restorative and transformative justice rhetorics and processes into their existing systems of punishment. The best example I can give you comes from my good friend and colleague, Nick Mitchell at UC Santa Cruz, who reminded me recently that it was about a year ago that you had a grading strike at UC Santa Cruz led by graduate students, right? Cost of living adjustment strike. And the one student, Carlos Cruz, there's one student who the administration decided to come after for punishment, and their modality of punishing him was framed as a transformative justice process, right? So there's an insidious way that university, college administrations, city administrations, mayor's offices, district attorney's offices will steal this rhetoric. They will turn it against the most abolitionist and progressive and transformative intentions of transformative restorative justice practitioners. And they will actually morph it into another form of student discipline and student punishment, or, off campus, it'll be an extension of criminal justice rather than an authentic displacement of criminal justice. So I think that's what we got to be careful about.
Thank you, Dylan. And Tyler, to you, I mean, you are part of an Office for Student Conflict Resolution. One thing I hope that you can do is define restorative justice and define it and how it differs from transformative justice, because I think there's a lot of people out there that might not really know the difference between the two.
Yeah, totally. It's a subtle but very distinct difference between the two. So restorative justice is a process that brings folks who have caused harm, so folks who have received harm, and the surrounding community together to have a conversation about what happened, what harm or impact was caused, and what can be done to make things right. So it's very incident focused in that sense, right? It focuses on, hey, what was it that occurred? What were the things that led up to it? And what can we do to address the situation in a way that focuses on growth, accountability, and support. So in that way, it's very defined related to the specific incident that occurred. In terms of transformative justice, has more of a focus on what systems are at play and what kind of things are leading to these to systems of oppression and systems of wrongdoing, and has a more kind of a larger purview, if that makes sense. I think of the way I think about it, and other people might take issue with this, and that's totally cool, is that restorative justice is one tactic in transformative justice. So transformative justice looks broadly at harm, at crime, at wrongdoing, and at the systems that are at play that cause those things. And restorative justice is one thing you can do to address that. So that's kind of how I position it. I know other people and scholars in both fields would maybe define it slightly differently, but that's the way it fits best with the work I do and how I see things in our field as well.
And Tyler, I want to stick with you for a moment because we did get a question. Someone wanted us to talk about UIPD, that's the police department on this campus, in terms of sexual assault and it being the most useful function the institution can serve. So I'm wondering, is sexual assault, is violent crime something that the RJ program at CU Boulder contends with? Have you led processes that involve those types of crimes?
We currently don't do anything with restorative justice and sexual assault or sexual misconduct in any capacity at the moment. That doesn't mean that won't change in the future, but that's the way the current accountability structures are at CU, just that it's handled by a different office than the one I work for. So it's something that is kept a little separate. And it certainly is something that is happening in a lot of universities across the nation. So there's growing precedent for that occurring. And the idea being that we want to focus on a process that gives people voice and choice. It gives them the ability to have conversations rather than saying, hey, these two people should never be able to talk about what happened. And ideally, these processes are victim driven. So you want to focus on ways to give the people who have received harm the ability to choose what they want to see happen. So it's not just hey, let's throw everybody in the same room, see what happens, or I guess at this point on Zoom together, but that we want to make sure that the processes are focused on the needs of victims involved. And I think that as these gain traction, you can see there's a lot of research out there about the criminal justice system and how people don't feel satisfied or feel like they're getting their answers and aren't able to engage in the conversations they want to have. And compared with restorative systems, there's a lot more satisfaction in those different types of conversations that folks can have. So I think, I know that's kind of, we don't currently do it at CU, but it is something that's happening at several campuses across the nation currently.
And Naomi, did you want to address that comment or that question that we got in about sexual assault and UIPD?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, like when we actually think about people who have been assaulted, right? And I have had really long conversations with some of our students who have gone through this process where they meet with the dean of students and they also have encounters with the police, right? It is a traumatizing experience, in addition to being traumatized by sexual assault and abusive relationships, right? The way I've heard it from several students is that it's not only re-triggering, but it's also, there's a lot of implicit victim blaming, right? That they get from the cops and frankly from the dean of students office, right? Basically, I've heard one student say that, if I find out you're lying about this, I'm gonna make sure you're expelled. Right? Or from the cops hearing, it's surprising that something like this could happen to someone as educated as you, something like that, right? So I think we have to recognize that police responses are not survivor-centered and that they can actually amplify the trauma that the survivor has, that the survivor has experienced. The other thing is that I think a transformative justice model would not just think about, okay, this incident happened. It wouldn't just be incident based, but it would also be addressing a campus culture where sexual violence is the kind of unstated background noise of our existence, right? If we have a situation where 1 out of 5 women students, not even counting any other gender, right? 1 out of 5 female students will be raped by the time they graduate, then that means that sexual violence and the patriarchal violence that undergirds sexual violence is so pervasive that we allow this to happen, right? And that 1 out of 5 statistic is most likely an undercounting, right? So transformative justice would also try to seek out the roots of that patriarchal violence and try to transform. And this is not going to happen in 4 years. This has to be an ongoing process, right? Where we really think about why are we clinging to these systems that actually harm not only women and non-binary people, but also men, people who are ostensibly privileged by this, right? So I think transformative justice for me, it is that panning out. So it is dealing with these incidents of harm and trying to restore what has been broken asunder by that, but it's also addressing the broader root causes of it so that we don't have 20% of our female students graduating as rape survivors.
Thank you, Naomi. And I want to go to Dylan. I know you had something to say about this point as well.
Just really quick, I think we have over a century of modern policing, of an archive of modern policing that clearly shows us that police power and police presence does not do anything to curb sexual and gender violence. In many cases, it exacerbates it. And I think that mandatory homework for everyone that is watching this session right now, especially because most of y'all are in Illinois, is to get familiar with the last quarter century, 25 years of Black feminist and abolitionist approaches to sexual and gender violence. You got 2 folks right near you who are leaders in this field, Beth Ritchie at University of Illinois, Chicago, Erica Miners at Northern Illinois University. I know there's a bunch of other people. Y'all find their stuff, their shit on YouTube, their work is probably up there, pirated PDFs, go read it, go talk about it. That's the solution. It's not going to be, trying to make the police respond to sexual and gender violence. That's just not happening.
And I want to pivot a little bit here to you, Craig. You care deeply about and work on issues of police accountability. For those unfamiliar with your work, you were part of the legal team that advocated for the release of the police dash cam footage showing the brutal murder of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald by a former Chicago police officer. So I have 2 separate but related questions for you. I'm going to give you both questions and you can respond to them. So basically the first question is how do we hold or how should we hold campus police officers accountable, a very kind of specific subset of police? And then second, should we move toward a police-free campus in the future?
Dang, tough. How do we hold police accountable? Who polices the police has been that age-old question, and we keep recreating around the United States. When people start talking about, let's look at best practices, let's look at models, when the truth is that nobody's gotten that right. Police, I cannot name a department or a place of one of the 18,000 plus law enforcement agencies in the United States in which there's a regime of accountability that folk trust. I am a strong believer and advocate as long as some form of state-based policing exists, and the same thing, whether it be university policing, is that it's who controls that apparatus, and that it's, there's lots of police community, community policing, police community relations that completely just get the diagnosis wrong. If only there were more police interactions, they're more positive, they're more friendly. We just need to, more police and more training, more this, more body cams. And it's bad diagnosis, bad solutions. If the issues and our structural racism, impunity, secrecy, then the answers in terms of then how you hold folk accountable, how you hold police accountable is by redistributing that power. And that is going to sound trite, information is power too. One of the things that we fought and succeeded and now created a principle in Illinois, a legal principle, that any records that relate to complaints of police abuse or misconduct belong to the people, belong to the public. And what we've seen in terms of, and it's that seems like just basic principle, the who's in charge. And there is no good system. We keep recreating these horrific systems of including, I can believe in civilian surveying isn't even the right word, but community-based investigations of police misconduct. That then, but there, I can't point to an agency or a place in which there's an agency that's empowered, that's resourced, and I mean empowered, that's independent and independent from, as others on this panel talked about, from the same systems, the same government, the university institution. And so, I mean, the answer is it begins with then that honesty. And then it's like, I think when you're also talking about campus policing and something that I think was inherent in some of the, or implicit in some of the pauses, particularly by some of the white students who are answering the questions, is that in that video, is that these systems have also, and we've got to be upfront about this, have benefited a lot of folks. This isn't an equal opportunity. I mean, and on campus as well, there is the same us against them, or us and them. And who's the us that the police are supposedly designed to protect? Whose interests are they there for? And who are the folks in which they are inspiring terror? And the same kind of stories that I was telling with students and high school students that I'm talking to in terms of social control, and it leads to self-censorship and restriction at the time, at basic restriction of your own, you self-restrict your liberty because of just fear of police intervention and terror, because almost just in the other kind of Dylan pause that he shared and pointed to some of the students, like that pause before yet hasn't happened to me yet. Every student who I've talked to, every Black student I've talked to and interacted, or virtually every student, if not having a personal experience, they'll know someone, and someone close, and a neighbor, a family member, a close friend who has. And we've all also had these talks with our own children as well. And then I have, at the same point, I teach highly privileged at University of Chicago white students. And one of the things that I used to be able to, quote unquote, allowed to do would be white students would be allowed to, not white students, but my students would sit in the back of a police car and go on a ride along. And I remember this one student who then shared the story with me. She came back from one of the ride alongs and she was just bewildered about it. She was like, every time the police car, and she seemed like she liked the police officers, they seemed nice, da 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 da. But every time they stopped, then in this case, they were patrolling public housing neighborhoods, a Black public housing neighborhood, same thing happened. And this was just normalized. It's that every young Black child knew, I'm supposed to get against the wall and assume the position. And the officers also knew exactly what they were supposed to do. And this woman who was telling me the story, she was confused because she's like, hey, in my law school classroom, I'm learning that for a police officer to do that, they have to actually have a reasonable belief, according to the Constitution or constitutional law, that each and every person that they stop are armed and dangerous. And just the two-tiered reality again, who's the us, whose interests are being protected, who's being assumed to be a threat and protected from whom, and then who is then relying on police for social control. And so I don't think even when we're having conversations about abolition that we can't afford to also ignore and be able to respond and meet arguments of many folks in institutions who are benefiting from the social control and marginalization of quote unquote others than them.
So that said, Craig, can you answer? I mean, I'm curious if you can answer, or if you've arrived at a feeling yet about whether or not you think, this institution policing should be on a college campus at this point, or is that something you're still working through?
I'll be honest that I'm still struggling on some points in terms. I think that I guess part of it is like the struggle of reimagining what still. I don't feel like I'm even saying this right. But I think the bottom line is that I think I'm still struggling and learning each and every day from folks who are experimenting, who are doing different things, who are succeeding and showing what I do know. And what I know for a fact is that We have far, far, far too many police, far, far, far too many prisons. They need to be reduced. I mean, don't need. And as I think Naomi said, and so much research out there that shows us that all these police have not, they've done the opposite of making all of us safer, and indeed have inflicted violence and in asymmetrical ways, as Dylan has pointed out. But I still struggle with it. And I can't lie that I still struggle with, there are still times and situations. And even when you ask me about accountability, and particularly when we're talking about asymmetrical power too, what do I want in my heart of hearts with a police officer? So if there's someone in the role of a police officer, I want them to be held accountable. That officer who shot and killed that 17-year-old boy and put 16 shots in his body as he stood over him, you know what? And I'm also going to say, as just an individual, as a parent, and then someone I love, it's like part of even change is that officer has been able to do that with impunity throughout their careers. And that, so I feel there's that. And then when even talking about sexual assault and sexual violence and the amazing work that, as Dylan has pointed out, done by dear friends of mine and models too. But I still also think about, and some aspects of that of also just fundamental abuses of power. And so while, yes, survivor victim centered in terms of choice and the reality of no, police and having police respond in the way they do, college administrators respond in the way they do, inflicting and re-traumatizing more harm. At the same point, I do believe in a role of accountability, particularly accountability toward those who abuse their power. Shit, I'd like to see President Trump in jail. I think there's a prison for him, and I'm cool with that.
Thanks, Craig. And thank you for being honest and kind of, struggling through that in an open forum. I appreciate your vulnerability there. I do want to transition back to you, Dylan. We've gotten some comments and some questions. This one I want to give to you as someone who's a staunch abolitionist, and I know you've been one for quite a long time. When the shots ring out in my hood, which one of y'all coming? So I think that is coming back to this issue of what happens when the unthinkable happens in a community, and can we establish something in its place that's going to serve the needs of victims?
Yeah, it's already happening. I actually responded to that in the chat. I plead guilty. I've been typing in the chat, responding to folks as we've been doing this. But I've been listening to you too, so I've been multitasking. But I know sometimes the interesting stuff happens in chats. I've been engaging with that. There's actually already existing examples of how to deal with that. Let's start from the premise though, right? We have to understand. We have to work from the same premise that police response to shots ringing out in somebody's neighborhood, Black neighborhood, brown neighborhood, right? Let's assume it's a Black or a brown neighborhood, right? That police response to that is not going to be a healthy one, if there is one, right? And the example that is very concrete, that is not far from where most of you all are on this call, is Ujima Medics. It is a paradigmatic, shining example of how to respond when shots ring out in the hood. This is two people who I had the pleasure of having a sustained conversation with now about 10 months ago, who talked about how their organization was founded on the basis of the fact that Chicago Police Department and Chicago 911 would invariably neglect, respond slowly, or simply ignore calls to 911 when a Black person would get shot in the neighborhood in Southside Chicago. So there were countless numbers of unnecessary gunshot deaths from people bleeding out because 911, as Flavor Flav once famously put it, was a joke, right? So what Ujima Medics decided to do was go from the grassroots, and what they've been doing now for a number of years is they train everybody from children to elders in emergency gunshot wound treatment. They've saved a countless number of Black folks' lives in the neighborhood by teaching people how to do emergency gunshot wound treatment, because they, as one of their co-founders said to me, they know that if you are Black and you're in Chicago, the police are not coming to help you, right? So out of necessity, people have already come up with answers to this question, right? And so Ujima Medics is a shining example of this. Hey, by the way, the other thing that Ujima Medics has been doing to prevent unnecessary and preventable Black deaths. They've taught people how to do emergency asthma attack treatments. That was another thing that was causing a lot of preventable Black death in Southside Chicago, was Black people that would have asthma attacks. 911 wouldn't respond and people would die unnecessarily from untreated asthma attacks. So they've actually taught people, from children to elders, how to do emergency asthma attack treatment. So we actually have examples. That's just my favorite one, but there's a whole bunch of these examples all over the country. We just have to do a fucking Google search. I mean, for real, that's what we got to do. Just, you're in an age where this information and these examples are out there. Bring them in. These folks will talk to you for free. You know what I'm saying? You don't need to pay $20,000 honorarium to get them in the room. They'll come and talk to you for free because lives are at stake. So let's do that. Let's do that.
Thank you, Dylan. And Austin, I want to go to you. What do you have to say in response to those concerns about, I think maybe specifically for campus police, what happens if there's something that I hear a lot personally from campus police is, what happens in the event of an active shooter? Or it doesn't have to be an active shooter. It could just be someone gets shot in interpersonal violence on this campus.
I think that the models that Dylan described are applicable on our campus as well. I mean, I think there's also a conversation to be had, not just about gun control, which I think can be a red herring in these conversations, especially because gun control has been used to criminalize Black and brown communities when they try to defend themselves against white supremacist violence. And we really need to be thinking about the culture of violence that leads to those things, right? And I won't go into like the psychologization of active shooters and things like that, but we know that it is about addressing mental health and catching those things before they escalate to a deadly and tragic situation. And that's kind of just coming back to all the things that we've been saying. So in addition to, to invoke the language of liberalism, like common sense gun control. And I say that as someone who's a registered gun owner, but addressing the culture of violence and white supremacy, which creates a lot of mass shootings, whether they be Dylan Roof or the shooting at the theaters in Colorado, not far from where Tyler works. So I think we need to zoom out a little bit. But I will say, I'm not an expert on responding to active shooting. Again, I would cite and encourage people to look up Aim for Peace in my hometown of Kansas City. Shout out to Kansas City, they've had a lot of success with that model. And they have a 24-hour emergency line for people to call. What if we had something like that at our campus here, right? That it was violence responders going to that situation rather than police, and we know people get killed in the crossfire of these things all the time, right? So, or when police are responding to those situations, they kill people in pursuit of people like that all the time. So how do we not compound that violence rather?
And Tyler, I want to come back to you for a minute, just to bring it down to sort of a practical level. At this time, and correct me if I'm wrong, RJ program at CU Boulder that works with campus police to some extent. You take referrals from the police, is that correct?
Yeah, we typically, we work with typically mostly with the Boulder court system and with the student conduct process at CU to take referrals from both of those agencies. So we're typically one step removed directly from working with the police, although we do get some direct referrals from the Boulder Police Department for some really low-level kind of violations. But I think steps like that will probably become more common in the future as we try to think about ways to really do practical strategies that can make things a little bit easier for everyone involved. So it's not something that we currently don't work with the police on a daily basis, but do respond to the ultimate result of activities that the police engage in, if that kind of makes sense. A little bit different distinction, but we're a little bit further down the line.
Well, I have a question for you, and you kind of alluded to this earlier in our conversation. How do you navigate working with traditional punitive systems, so court systems or traditional punitive systems of justice, while also trying to forge a path for restorative justice, which is not supposed to be punitive in nature, it's supposed to be restorative in nature? How do you walk that line on a campus, which is, you're also part of a big institution?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of things at play and a lot of things at stake. So for example, let's say a student gets a ticket for noise violation in the community. They can both be held responsible by the court system and by the student conduct process. And so we work with both to try to have the only outcome from the case is the student going through a restorative justice process. And that means working with the court system to have the court system divert things to a restorative justice approach, and also from the student conduct process to have them send it only through a restorative justice approach. So that way we can kind of serve both entities in that way and have the restorative justice process be the only kind of main outcome from the case. And then also work with each case individually. So there's all sorts of different things that can happen and all sorts of reasons why folks end up committing violations. And we don't want to just treat it as, hey, you committed this violation, therefore here's what happens. But instead we're like, hey, so what occurred? Tell me more about what happened. And we can figure out, okay, hey, do we need to figure out like things that you need to do related to academics? Can we help you get more connected to campus? What are the things that you need to be successful, and how can this process help be a springboard so you can do those things, rather than, hey, here's the thing you violated and here's the standard punishment that comes with that. So it has a far more tailored approach and focuses not at all out of our process. The goal is to have nothing end up be punitive or just doing things for the sake of doing things, but rather doing things that address harm and address root causes of situations as well.
I appreciate that, Tyler. We actually just got a text question in that says, I live close to campus. I'm assuming they mean the U of I campus. How do I transform even my neighborhood to not rely on campus police anytime something goes wrong? I imagine there's a couple of you who want to answer that. Maybe we go to Naomi first, if that's something you want to address.
Yes. So, I mean, I think this is why, you know, we also need concrete alternatives right now. So I think the Ujima medics is a great example of that. So in the absent, when you know that the cops are not there for you, right? If you're living in the south or west sides of Chicago, right? You need something else, but sometimes we need to create those alternatives. And so I feel like we need greater investment in those alternatives, right? Or we need like the Ujima medics, that is basically a mutual aid kind of model of providing the services that people need, right, in their neighborhoods. And then also thinking about transformative justice is not just about these individual incidents, right, as we've been talking about, but it's also about thinking about where am I situated? Who is in my network? And then how do I expand that network, right? How do I build the kind of relationships of trust and reciprocity in that neighborhood? So do you actually know your neighbors? You know you live in this neighborhood, but do you actually know the people on your block, right? Or in a 3-block radius from you? Like if you hear like a parent or somebody having a kind of squabble or something, do you know them and trust them enough to be like, hey, what's going on? Is there something I can like kind of help you with or something like that? Most of us don't. And I will say that I am one of these people that needs to work on these skills, right? But like we need to have really robust relationship building, and relationship building is not some like, I'm sure the cops would dismiss it as being like impractical or whatever, but like these relationships are the actual core foundation of community building. And I think when we think of community building, it's often in these kind of abstractions like the UIUC community or something like that, right? But who are the people that you can actually go to when you've been harmed? Who are the people that you can actually go to if you've actually harmed someone else? And so who can you go to who will hold you accountable without shaming you, right? And who will be there for you and who will like support your needs, right? Right, and help you work through the kind of feelings that you might be having about harming someone else, like shame and fear and all those kinds of things. Who is in your network, right? So how do you build those kinds of relationships in your neighborhood, right? And there's things that you can do collectively together to kind of build those relationships. But I also think it would be useful to have some kind of socially supported scaffolding so that we can help build these relationships together. Right? So whether it's a community organization or something like that, right? It is very hard when we have been kind of so socialized into believing in rugged individualism and instead of community, and thinking that like it is on me to take care of all of my needs, right? When the fact of the matter is, each of us as individuals is absolutely dependent on everyone around us, right? But we don't really think in those terms. So we need to kind of rethink, re-engage, right, our relationships with other people. And I think that has to be socially supported. It can't just be you on your own transforming your neighborhood, right? I'm gonna check, thanks.
All right, and Dylan, I think you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, to the person that sent that question, and go to bigdoorbrigade.com. It is our friend and colleague, Dean Spade's phenomenal resource. It's a phenomenal resource site if you want to do exactly the kind of work you're talking about. It's mutual aid based, and it helps clarify what the difference is between charity and mutual aid. And I think this is something that I feel like I've been a student of in a really intense way since COVID-19 here. And Dean helped me understand how a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in most of my adult life actually is actually mutual aid. I just didn't have the language and the analysis for it. So I consider myself a student of mutual aid, and I want to encourage folks that are sharing that question to go to that resource. And there's other ones too, but that's probably the best one I've seen.
And then Austin, what do you want to add?
Yeah, just a real quick story to share like what that might look like. And also just to tack on real quick to the mass shooting question, I just want to flag that police don't do anything to reduce those situations either. There's no like, verifiable evidence that like the presence of police are reducing mass shootings, and that's a deeper American problem. But thinking about preventing interactions with the police in your neighborhood, and like Naomi, I'm kind of like an introverted person, so it's hard for me. But just a story about like my neighbor here. I live in a small apartment complex, and we pass each other all the time. We say what's up. We have a like a cordial relationship. He mentioned to me in passing. He lives a couple doors down to me, that the person above him is really loud and it really disturbs his quality of life, right? And he's like, I'm not sure what to do because like I don't want to call the police. I don't want to contact the landlord about it because they'll probably just tell me to call the police. And so because we had built a relationship, not even a deep relationship, just like a cordial, friendly relationship you build with your neighbor as you like are commuting and stuff like that, we were able to kind of work out what to do. And he went and knocked on that person's door and talked about his issue, and it helped, right? And he also got some noise canceling headphones. Like those two things, like it prevented the police from coming to the situation. And this person, this particular person who was being loud was a non-English speaking international student. And so you can imagine all the ways that could go wrong if a police officer shows up, right? So like kind of an innocuous situation, but prevented the police from coming, right? And so like, it doesn't have to be like you're developing this deep, like lifelong bond with somebody, right? Just like being able to talk with somebody about what they're going through in a cordial way.
Thank you so much, Austin. I really appreciate that example. We only have about 7 to 10 minutes left of our discussion tonight. So I want to end with a reflection from every one of you. So, as we close this conversation, I would love for you to reflect on something that you're going to take away from our conversation tonight. Maybe something you learned, maybe something that you're going to think more deeply about. And Craig, we can start with you.
Always start with the hard questions, but I appreciate it. I guess first, I'm just so humbled to be on this panel and with folks who aren't just theorizing about this work, but who are actually doing the work and creating and making it real in our various communities. And I guess so, what I take away, in addition to the obvious brilliance of folk who I feel so blessed to be surrounded with in this moment, is each and every one of those resources that folk have pointed to and examples, because I think that the way in which things change, and I think this is among the takeaways, that it's not like, ooh, there's one model and here's the one right model and one size that fits all. But what it takes is all of us being creative, experimenting, doing things, and then learning from one another. And so I don't have like a one takeaway, but just listening, hearing, and learning from each and every one of the folk experience about, yeah, this isn't just a theoretical, abstract dream of a world without police, but here are many, as folks have shared, concrete examples, including my own backyard with people who I know and love that have been named already here in this conversation, who are actually doing it and showing us the way. And so I guess my teach back to others would be, it's really upon, and I think Dylan put this well, not just use the fucking internet, but it's really the arrogance I see so much that surrounded by in an elite college, university campus, and really means like there's a lot of knowledge out there that exists on the ground of people who are doing this work, and the humility to not just, you don't know better, forget this like white knight savior, again, Gene Spade, charity versus mutual self-aid stuff, but listen to, respect people who are experiencing this on the ground, who have been most impacted by these very same institutions that too many of us just still take for granted and take as just a given.
Thank you, Craig. And Naomi?
Yeah, so before we kind of check out here, I just want to thank you again for doing these and for your excellent reporting. I think there are two things that I'm going to take away from here. So first of all is Dylan's kind of cautionary framing about the risk of co-optation, right? And also I want to highlight that co-optation is already happening. It's already in motion because the UIPD is trying to put on this kinder, gentler face. Like, we want to communicate with the students. We're going to go to the Illinois student government and say, you know, even though we over police Black people, it's not students, so it's okay, right? Or incorporating mental health services into the police, recasting canines, police canines as therapy dogs, right? All of this is co-optation. All of it is still policing. None of it makes it better. It just re-legitimizes the police when it is illegitimate, right? And it gives them more resources and power, right? So we need to be really on point about not allowing that to happen. And if, you know, by some miracle, the administration thinks that TJ is something worth investing in, we have to be very, very vigilant about ensuring that it does not get enfolded into punitive processes, right, of student discipline or of the courts or anything like that, right? And I think that we have cautionary tales in kind of feminist work that was dealing with domestic violence, right? And the kind of shift from providing services to domestic violence survivors, and then slowly being incorporated into a punitive justice system that works tightly with police, and that ultimately enforces this thing called carceral feminism, which actually isn't feminism, because feminism has to be abolitionist, right? Okay, so these are some cautionary tales for us. The other thing I'm going to take away is Austin's example about talking to his neighbor. And I think this is such a fantastic example because we are not necessarily skilled up in these kind of communications, right? And I think that Austin's example shows us that we need to kind of building these relationships, building the skills to like have an uncomfortable conversation with your neighbor who's very annoying to you, right? These are small ways that we can practice the skills that we are going to need when it comes down to the big stuff, right? And so this again is something that practicing transformative justice models of communication, of accountability, of working through difficult confrontations, right? We can flex those muscles. When Mia Mingus says it's like accountability is a muscle. The more we exercise it, the stronger it gets. And so I think that like that little example that Austin, you provided us it gives us a really concrete way of thinking about this and how that kind of little example can build into what actually happens when a terrible event happens. How do we actually deal with it? If we're already skilled up on how to communicate, how to express our feelings, how not to turn away from each other and throw each other away, then that will help us into transforming the culture of our campus. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And Tyler, what about you?
Yeah, I'm taking away a really, Dylan, thank you so much for the reflection on the co-optation stuff. I think that's really interesting and something that I think is, we talk a lot in the restorative justice field about how to practice with fidelity, right? And I think part of that is also like, what systems are you embedded in, and how are you making overall like things, how are you repairing harm overall rather than perpetuating it? And I think that that's something that's really interesting to think about. So that's one nugget I'm taking away from the conversation today. And I think the other thing is just how many resources are out there. People were mentioning resource after resource after resource of all these different interesting and creative ideas that folks are implementing in different parts of the US. And I think that's just it's really encouraging to see that there's lots of these little pockets of things happening. And I think that's a kernel of hope that I'm taking away from this conversation today.
Thank you, Tyler. And just a note to our audience, we're going to try and collect those resources that have been shared today and include them when we post the recorded versions of these videos online. So thank you again, Tyler, for reminding us how much was shared tonight. Austin, I want to go to you next. What are you going to take away from this conversation?
The first thing that comes to mind is just how difficult this all is. Like I said, like this is a struggle, and I'm really happy to be in it with all the people on this panel. And it really motivates me to keep going and reminds me that I'm not alone. And I hope people listening in can think about the people in their lives and the structures in their lives that support them, that don't resort to punishment and violence to address their issues personally or socially. And I think the stories too, I think I'll be using Tyler's, story about like picking the timeout chair, picking the time to talk that he shared at the beginning. Like that's a good way to think about it. And it just makes me grateful again for everybody here and for everybody I'm working with on this campus with my union, the GEO, and also everybody in the defund movement. So I have to say shout out to Candace, Angela, Lupe, Serene, Nachiketa, Logan, David, Becca, Hiba. I love you all, and you are the reason that we keep going, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you.
Thank you for that reflection, Austin. And then finally, Dylan.
I would be completely yelled at tomorrow if I did not give a shout out to UC Cops Off Campus, UC Riverside Cops Off Campus. Y'all are the ones that got me into this conversation. I want to say what you all have taught me tonight is that we need to continue to proliferate these conversations. If we are taking our own analysis seriously, we are dealing with a comprehensive, site-specific, and also site-generalized condition of domestic war. We need to deal with this common sense around policing. We need to proliferate these conversations. We need to coordinate them. We need to engage with anybody that's willing to participate them, as long as they're not just trolling. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be the California interloper in the Illinois thing, but also say that this is actually how it should be, right? We should actually be promiscuous about inviting each other into these conversations all the damn time. We need to take the proliferation seriously. And I'll say this too, I see what we're doing as an obligation. I see us as having no other choice, but I also see it as a privilege. I say that there's some privilege, there's a humility, there's also a kind of honor in doing this work with you all. And I think we should fucking laugh and enjoy it. I actually think that there's a lot of room to, engage this thing as something that gives us a sense of life, of community, and of humor, even if it's gallows humor at times, right? Like we got to be able to engage in this as a practice of human being that is abolitionist. So it's not just this negative work all the time. So we're actually building another way of being in the world, another way of communing in the world, and that's y'all remind me of that tonight. So again, I want to thank you, Lee, for getting me in this.
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you for taking us out on a note of joy. I really appreciate that. I also appreciate that we have 3 different time zones represented here with Tyler in Colorado and with Dylan in California. So this was no easy feat. It was a lot of time that you all took out of your day. So I really, really, really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to participate in tonight's conversation, as it's a complicated, difficult, but also a really enjoyable conversation to have. So again, just to reintroduce all of you, Dylan Rodriguez is a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California, Riverside, a member of UCFTP Cops Off Campus, which is a faculty-led movement with the goal of removing cops from the campuses of California state colleges and universities by this coming fall. We also had Tyler Keyworth, who's the Assistant Director for Conflict Resolution and Restorative Justice at the University of Colorado Boulder, And in that role, he oversees the university's conflict resolution and restorative justice efforts. And of course, Naomi Palk, who is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois. Her research and teaching focuses on racism and imprisonment, policing, and immigration issues. Austin Hoffman, a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Illinois and a member of the campus's Graduate Employees Organization, also called GEO. Again, which is advocating for the defunding of university police on this campus. And then finally, Craig Futterman, who's a clinical professor of law and a resident dean at the University of Chicago Law School. He also founded and has served as the director of the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project of the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic since 2000. And I also want to give a shout out, thanks to the student journalists who, under the instruction of University of Illinois professor Chris Evans, collected the voices you heard during the video we played at the beginning of our conversation. They are Vivian Law, Carolina Garibay, Luis Velazquez, Owen Henderson, Scarlett O'Hara, Sharice Jones, and Farah Anderson. Thank you to all of you student journalists. And if you missed any part of this conversation or want to watch our initial panel, or perhaps you want to share this discussion with your friends and family, you can find recordings of both tonight's panel and the panel we hosted earlier this month on the Illinois Newsroom Facebook and Illinois Public Media YouTube pages. Again, my name is Lee Gaines, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
So much, you all.
Yeah, and I don't want to lose all the resources that you shared in the chat.